But first, a comment on that remark that scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery. That's very close to the view that we call scientism, the notion that science is the only way to truth. And that conviction really characterizes many of the new atheists, particularly Richard Dawkins and now apparently Stephen Hawking. Nobel laureate Sir Peter Medawar pointed out some time ago the danger of this scientistic view in a wonderful book called Advice to a Young Scientist. He said, there is no quicker way for a scientist to bring discredit upon himself and upon his profession than roundly to declare, particularly when no declaration of any kind is called for, that science knows or soon will know the answers to all questions worth asking, and that questions which do not admit a scientific answer are in some way non-questions or pseudo-questions that only simpletons ask and only the gullible profess to be able to answer. Medawar goes on to say this: the existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things, questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? And he adds that it is to imaginative literature and religion that we must turn for the answers to such questions. Francis Collins is equally clear on the limitations of science. Science is powerless, he says, to answer questions such as why did the universe come into being? What is the meaning of human existence? What happens after we die? Now, it is clear that Medawar and Collins are passionate scientists, so that there is no obvious inconsistency involved in being a committed scientist in the highest level, while simultaneously recognizing that science cannot answer every kind of question, including some of the deepest questions that human beings can ask. So Hawking appears to be unaware of this. And I want to go straight to the heart of the book, The Grand Design, with this central claim: because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Now, perhaps the first question to ask is, what does Hawking mean when he uses the word nothing? The universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Because notice the assumption in the first part of that statement: because there is a law of gravity. That is an assertion of existence. Because there is something, the universe will create itself out of nothing. It's a very odd way to start, isn't it? Hawking assumes that there is a law of gravity. But one might want to be generous and presume that he also assumes that gravity exists, for the simple reason that an abstract mathematical law on its own would be vacuous with nothing to describe, a point to which I shall return. But the main issue surely is this: gravity, or a law of gravity, is not nothing, if Hawking is using that word in its usual philosophically correct sense of non-being. If he's not, he should have told us. So the heart of this book appears to be an assertion that the universe is simultaneously created from nothing and from something, which I do not regard as a very promising start. Now, of course, I am aware that when physicists talk about nothing, they often appear to mean a quantum vacuum, which is manifestly not nothing. And Hawking alludes to it later in the book. We are a product, he says, of quantum fluctuations in the very early universe. I'm tempted to suspect that a lot of this is a bit too much ado about nothing. Now, I know it's late in the morning for logic, ladies and gentlemen, but I just pointed out to you what I think is the first level of self-contradiction in Hawking's statement. But I believe there to be three, and I have subsequently tried to invent a sentence in English that also contains 3 levels of self-contradiction, and I haven't been able to do so. So my challenge to you is to try and copy Hawking by producing something parallel to it. Let's analyze it a bit further. The universe can and will create itself. Now, if I say X creates Y, I'm presupposing the existence of X in order to bring Y into existence. That is what the word means. So if I say X creates X, I am presupposing the existence of X to account for the existence of X. Well, this is obviously self-contradictory, and it's logically incoherent, even if we put X equal to the universe. To presuppose the existence of the universe to account for the existence of the universe sounds like something out of Alice in Wonderland, not science. Now that's a second distinct level of contradiction. The first one, you will recall, is the universe is created out of something which is nothing. The second is it creates itself. But then the notion that the law of gravity, that a law of nature explains the existence of the universe, is also self-contradictory. Since a law of nature, by definition, surely depends for its own existence on the prior existence of the nature it purports to describe. And I shall come back to that later. So I would submit to you, however provocatively it may seem to you, that the main conclusion of the grand design turns out to be a triple self-contradiction. Philosophers just might be tempted to comment, so that's what comes of saying philosophy is dead. Oxford chemist Peter Atkins, whom I believe is to be the subject of a debate later, believes, I quote, that space-time generates its own dust in the process of its own self-assembly. Atkins dubs this the cosmic bootstrap principle, referring, of course, to the self-contradictory idea of a person lifting himself by pulling on his own bootlaces. Well, our Oxford colleague, Keith Ward, is surely right to say that Atkins' view of the universe is as blatantly self-contradictory as the name he gives to it, pointing out that it is logically impossible for a cause to bring about some effect without already being in existence. Ward concludes, between the hypothesis of God and the hypothesis of a cosmic bootstrap, there's no competition. We were always right to think that persons are universes who seek to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps are forever doomed to failure. What this goes to show, ladies and gentlemen, is that nonsense remains nonsense even when it's talked by world-famous scientists. But what it serves to obscure, what serves to obscure the illogicality is the fact that the statements are made by scientists. Because it seems to me in the whole contemporary debate, one of the dangers, a real danger, is that we confuse a statement by a scientist with a statement of science. Not all statements by scientists are statements of science, and therefore they do not enjoy whatever authority you ascribe to science itself. Immense prestige and authority do not compensate for faulty logic. Now, the worrying thing about all of this to me is that this illogical notion of the universe creating itself out of a nothing, which is a something, by a law of gravity which appears to exist without gravity itself, possibly, is not a peripheral point in the book The Grand Design. It's the key argument. And if the key argument is invalid, in one sense, there's little left to say. However, since the laws of nature play a major role in Hawking's argument, it might be important to comment on them as well. Because I detect what look like at least some very serious misunderstandings regarding the nature and capacity of the laws of nature. And to approach this, I'd like to draw attention to another feature of the book which really is relevant to the issue that's faced by many, particularly young people today. And that is the mistake made by Dawkins, Hitchens, and all the rest of them in presenting before the public the choice between God and science, and saying that you have got to choose between the two. In Hawking's specific case, it's between God and the law of gravity, but you will take the point. Talking about M theory, for example, Hawking writes, M theory predicts that a great many universes were created out of nothing. Their creation does not require the intervention of some supernatural being or God. Rather, these multiple universes arise naturally from physical law. So the opposition that's being presented is God or a law of nature. And then he talks about the intervention of a supernatural being. And what I observe about all of them is this. It's not that I have problems with their notion of science, though I have those. It seems to me that a systemic problem in this whole debate arises from the new atheists having espoused a false concept of God. And it's well worthwhile when reading their books to ask, what sort of God are you actually talking about? Let's listen carefully to Hawking's concept of God. Ignorance of nature's ways, he writes, with Mlodinow, led people in ancient times to invent gods to lord it over every aspect of human life. They then suggest that this began to change with Greek thinkers like Thales of Miletus about 2,600 years ago. The idea arose that nature follows consistent principles that could be deciphered, and so began the long process of replacing the notion of the reign of the gods with the concept of the notion of a universe that is governed by laws of nature and created according to a blueprint we could someday learn to read. In other words, if you update that a little bit, Hawking's notion of God is of a God of the gaps who can be displaced by scientific advance. Now, the importance of this cannot be overestimated and emphasized for this simple reason. If you conceive of God as a God of the gaps, then of course you're going to have to choose between God and science by definition. Because the God of the gaps view is saying, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. And the more science fills the gap, the less space there is for God. So you have to choose between the two. That is logical. It took me a long time to realize that this is what is going on. It's a false concept of God that they're tilting at. And so their appeal to the thinking public resonates because many people have bought into the very same idea. That people like you and I, at least speaking for the Christians here, believe in a God of the gaps. But we don't, of course. We believe in a God who's not only a God of the gaps, but God of the whole show. He's not, of course, merely the God of the deists who lit the blue touch paper. He both created the universe and constantly sustains it in existence. Without him, there would be nothing for physicists like Hawking to study. So that God is, according to the Christian faith at least, the creator both of the bits of the universe we don't understand and the bits we do. And of course it's the bits we do understand, by definition, that give us the most evidence of God's existence and activity. And the logic of that is very simple. My admiration of the genius behind a work of engineering or art increases the more I understand the difficulty and the competences that lie behind it. So the more I understand science, the more my worship of the Creator increases. And what Hawking and Mlodinow are doing here is to make a classical category mistake by confusing two entirely different kinds of explanation. Explanation in terms of physical law, and let's add mechanism for good measure, and personal agency. So inviting us to choose between God and science not only depends on a false concept of God, it depends on making a profound mistake in what constitutes an explanation. God is an explanation of the universe, but not the same type of explanation as that given by physicists. Suppose, to make it clearer, I replace the universe by a jet engine, and we're asked to explain it. Well, we could explain it in terms of the laws of nature, mechanical aeroengineering, and so on. Or we could explain it by saying it was the personal invention of Sir Frank Whittle. It would be utterly nonsensical to ask an audience to choose between the two. Do you accept that the aero engine came about by I suppose, unguided natural processes arising from the laws of physics, or by Sir Frank Whittle's inventive genius? And you would say that's absurd. To give a complete explanation, which is not merely a scientific explanation, you of course need both. I find school children can follow this. I find Dawkins cannot. I wonder why there is a difference. Perhaps I'm scared now that he's descended to writing books for school children. But anyway, this seems to me to be immensely important. That God as an explanation is not the same kind. I think it was Richard Swinburne who once said, I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. God is, in that sense, the ground of all explanation. And so at that level, the explanations are complementary. And it is noteworthy that this category mistake that Hawking, following Dawkins, makes was not made by Newton, at least not in the context of the law of gravity. Because when Newton discovered the law, he did not say, now that I have the law of gravity, I don't need God. What he did do was write Principia Mathematica, the most famous book in the history of science, expressing the hope that it would persuade the thinking man to believe in God. But there's more to be said. The laws of physics can explain how the jet engine works, but not how it came to exist in the first place. It is self-evident that jet engines could not have been created by the laws of physics on their own. That task needed intelligent input, creative engineering, the work of Frank Whittle. But not even the laws of physics, plus the creative genius of Frank Whittle, could produce a jet engine. There needed to be some material stuff subject to those laws that could be worked on by Whittle. Matter, ladies and gentlemen, may be humble stuff, but it isn't produced by laws. Now, the jet engine can help us further, because it helps us to see where some of the possible limits of science are. And as one of the general points is often made, people say that science, generally speaking, asks the how questions. How does the jet engine work? Or the why question regarding function. Why is this pipe here and why is that one there? But it doesn't ask or answer the why questions of purpose. And of course, that is why Whittle himself will not normally appear in any lectures one might give on aerodynamics. You see, as a mathematician, I'm often faced with Laplace's famous statement to Napoleon when Laplace, a brilliant French mathematician, had presented his book to Napoleon, and Napoleon said to him, and where is God in this? And Laplace's reply was, je n'ai pas besoin de cette hypothèse. I don't need that hypothesis. And of course he was dead right. If I'm explaining how a projectile moves in a parabolic orbit in a vacuum under gravity, I don't mention God either. But if I were asked, or if Laplace had been asked, why is there a universe at all which obeys these laws. He might have had to mention God, mightn't he? He was answering the right question, of course, with the right answer. As to its relevance to the existence of God, it has, of course, none. And, of course, that is what many scientists and others do with God. They define the range of questions which science is permitted to ask in such a way that God is excluded from the start, and then some of them go on to claim that science proves that God is unnecessary. That is very curious, a bit of logic, isn't it? And they often fail to say that it is their assumption, their atheist worldview, not science as such, that excludes God. I hope you've noticed, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, that the scientists didn't put the universe there. Indeed, I'm often tempted to reflect, because it keeps one humble, that any scientist studies a given with a given. The universe is a given. The human mind is a given. So we ought to be humble enough to realize that what we're doing is studying a given with a given. But if scientists didn't put the universe there, neither did their theories nor the laws. And yet Hawking seems to suggest they did. Is the unified theory so compelling, he wrote in A Brief History of Time, that it brings about its own existence? There's the self-contradictory self-reference again. Now, much as I find it hard to believe, Hawking claims that all is necessary to create the universe is the law of gravity. And when he was asked on Larry King Live, which I believe is an American TV program, where gravity came from, he answered, M theory. So gravity comes from theory. That's where it comes from. Well, to say that a theory or a physical law could bring anything into existence is surely to misunderstand what theory is. Scientists construct theories involving mathematical laws to describe natural phenomena. But on their own, those theories and laws cannot cause anything, let alone create it. It's delightfully ironic, isn't it, that it was none other than William Paley who pointed this out a long time ago. He's speaking of the person who just stumbled on a watch on the heath, the famous story. He says that such a person would not be less surprised to be informed that the watch in his hand was nothing more than the result of the laws of metallic nature. It is a perversion of language to assign any law as the efficient operative cause of anything. A law presupposes an agent, for it is only the mode according to which an agent proceeds. It implies a power, for it is the order according to which that power acts. Without this agent, without this power, which are both distinct from itself, the law does nothing, is nothing. And surely that is obvious from Hawking's own examples. The very first example he gives us of physical law is this. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. That is a law. It is an observed regularity in that sense. It is descriptive and predictive. But the law that the sun rises in the east or sets in the west doesn't move the sun, and it certainly didn't create the sun, did it? So the very example the man gives, Newton's law of motion, have never in the whole of the history of the universe caused a snooker ball to move over a table. It's a person with a cue that does that. The laws will describe, at least for the first couple of bounces before chaotic effects set in, what's going to happen. But laws don't cause anything nor create anything. So what can Hawking possibly mean by saying the universe arises naturally from physical law?